was about 7 years old, my father bought a few hundred acres in southern Mississippi, about 1.5 hours west of Mobile, Alabama. He built a small cabin on top of a hill that was in the middle of a large field, surrounded by woods. This house was about 5 miles from a paved road, and to get to our land, it took nearly 10 minutes of driving down dirt roads from the main highway, which was south of the house. About a quarter-mile north from the house, he built a small lake, more like a pond. It was about as long as a football field, but wider. And to get to this lake from the house, you could take Route A, which was hard-packed dirt road that was lined with dogwood trees. It was beautiful in the spring. Route B was about 100 yards east of Dogwood Lane, and we named it Vampire Trail because it was always so gloomy. The trees blocked out the sun on the brightest days, and it had a slight decline as you walked towards the lake. I say walked because this trail was not for vehicles. Thick woods filled the area outside and in between both trails. One morning during the fall, my parents and my little sister had gone to get ice cream and do some shopping. This trip would take them at least an hour or two. I was 10 years old, so I decided to go fishing while listening to Bama play Ole Miss. The game was the usual Bama win, so I thought I could ease the boredom of a blowout by fishing in the well-stocked lake. So I carried my pole, small radio, and my small ice chest. I had an Airedale Terrier named Bully that never left my side, and it was on this day I realized how awesome he really was. On to the lake we went. Picture a large oval, roughly the size of a football field, but larger, with an L-shaped pier in the southeast corner. Vampire Lane opened up to a more severe decline to the shore, and then the small pier. Across the lake on the west side, there was a narrow tree line that separated the shore from Dogwood Lane. The north side of the lake was the dam, and the south ended in thick and swampy woods. Fortunately for me, I realized later. About 5 minutes after I threw out my line, and 2 Bama touchdowns later, I got that feeling. It's a feeling I have come to recognize well, and it may have saved my life to this day. The feeling of being watched by something dangerous. Bully must have felt it too, because a few seconds later, I could hear him growling low and staring across the lake to the west. To the tree line that separated Dogwood Lane from the lake, I turned my head in that direction, and almost immediately my eyes lit on what I thought to be a half silhouette of a large man behind a tree. It was too far to make out details, but close enough to be sure of what I was seeing. About 5 minutes went by, and right before I scolded myself for an overactive imagination, the half silhouette moved behind a tree slowly. Bully stood and growled louder, and I told him quietly to stop, and I turned my head north towards the dam while keeping my eyes and attention rooted to that tree. Over the next 10 minutes, which felt like hours, I watched while this figure moved slowly from tree to tree, always north and always facing me. The saying "scared stiff" was something I found to be true. For some reason, I thought it important that whoever or whatever it was did not know I was aware. I finally realized that the figure's path was bringing it closer to the dam, which would make its path to me shorter and easier. My paralysis broke, and I casually put down the fishing pole and started walking towards Vampire Lane. As an adult, I was in the army for 11 years as an MP, but not turning to look over my shoulder during that walk was the hardest thing I have ever done. In my mind's eyes, whatever it was screaming across the dam towards me. When I hit the tree line, I broke into a run. As I was running, Bully dashed ahead of me, and my anger turned into admiration as he stopped some 20 yards ahead and faced north until I passed him. He continued this action the entire run home. My dog was watching my back. Just epic. Although I can grasp the awesomeness of this now, at the time I was so scared that I was literally sick. Even at such a young age, I knew that a large man watching and trying to creep up on a 10-year-old boy was up to no good. When I reached the cabin, I immediately locked the door and got one of my dad's shotguns as well as his .38 revolver. I sat at the large front window, my eyes glued to both trail openings and the woods between them. My family returned shortly after, and for some reason I did not mention what happened. I never felt safe there again. When me and my friends or my little sister wanted to go anywhere other than the area around the cabin, I made sure my parents were with us. What scares me the most, though, is the fact that our closest neighbors were about 2 miles northwest of us, with thick woods in between as the crow flies. Who or what the hell was watching me from the woods that day? Guess I may never know. I sometimes wish I could go back then, as a grown man with military training as I am now. Bully lived a full life, and was put to sleep peacefully as a very old, but great dog. The best dog I have ever known. Number 2. This is a convoluted story, so bear with me as I try to convey everything I can recall about what led me to the conclusion that my ex-housemate could have potentially been a serial killer, or a serial killer in the making. It was the summer of 2015 when I moved in, and at first appearances, my housemate/landlord Mike was somewhat normal, if not a bit socially awkward and dysfunctional. When I was signing the papers, he was adamant that I should never go into the basement, which I thought was odd, but I really needed a place to stay. And well, people have their little quirks, so I just chalked it up to that at the time. As I got to know Mike and our cohabitation continued, I learned more about the depths of his dysfunction. Firstly, that he used meth. Now, I don't automatically judge people based on vices, but I was surprised at the extent of his use. He was probably the first person I knew who used meth and balanced a full-time job, enjoyed a decent amount of success. The reason this is important to the story is that when he would be around the house, drinking and using meth, he would start to run off at the mouth. He would often joke that if I smelled lye coming from the basement, not to think anything of it. I think it was probably the third time he said this that I asked why he keeps saying that, and he said, "I use chemicals to clean up after the bodies," with a wily grin on his face. I tried to chalk that up to a bad sense of humor, but it didn't really sit right with me. He was also very particular that I let him know of my coming and going and my work schedule. I remember him being shocked and uncomfortable one day that I ended up taking off of work because he didn't realize that I was home. I remember that day because there was a lot of clanging and what sounded like muffled shouting coming from the basement. His car was in the driveway, but he was not in the main house or his bedroom. Other days, he would play very loud music that bumped through the whole house. Sometimes he would even play NPR talk radio at those volumes. In retrospect, I think he may have been trying to mask sounds. He would make remarks about sex workers, saying, "You can do whatever you want. You can choke them or beat them to death and nobody cares." I took exception to this. I told him I thought that was messed up. But when he would get tweaking, he'd always come back around to alluding to the same kind of violence, talking about how he was a normal white guy who owned a house and had a good career, so the police would never suspect him. At this point, I start to think that it has gone too far to simply be a joke. I was in a weird position because money was tight at the time and my options were few. I tried to convince myself that even if he is messed up, he is probably just engaging in outward fantasism. I knew that he would acquire the services of sex workers on occasion, but again, did not judge that activity at face value, but started becoming concerned. Then, at one point when I was doing laundry, I caught whiffs of decomposition. The house we were in was southeast Portland. It was relatively new, having grown up in upstate New York. I know that animals can be trapped in walls and die, but this was the garage, and there was no animals scurrying in the walls. This was strange and telling to me. I considered carefully what I would do, and decided I would confront him about the smell. I decided to poise the question in a somewhat suggestive way by expanding on his jokes. I told him that he needs to do a better job cleaning up the bodies because I smelled decomposition from the garage. I will never forget his reaction. His eyes widened, and he shot me a sharp glare, somewhere between fear and anger. He stumbled over his words and eventually responded, "What? Really?" I said, "Yes, really." And there were a few seconds of awkwardness before he said, "Thanks for letting me know," and promptly went into his bedroom and shut the door. A few days after that, he went into the upper crawl space in the garage while I was again doing laundry. He called for me and was trying to convince me to come up into the crawl space. My body locked up, and it was like my instincts were screaming at me that if I went up there, I would not come back down. I gave some excuse that I can sparsely remember that I had to be someplace, packed up my laundry, threw it in my room, and left. He spent a lot of time in the padlocked basement without a doorknob. The only way in was through the backyard. I wish I would have gone down there in retrospect, to either confirm or dismiss the suspicions once and for all. In the last couple months I had lived there, I was privy to more graphic comments about women and sex workers, explicit talk of sexual violence, and he was using more and more. He once showed me a video he made. He is a graphic designer and artist as well, which featured heavy bondage themes interspersed with distorted audio of women screaming and the strange leering figure in a plague doctor costume. It was one of those situations where any one of these things alone may be innocuous, but as they accumulated, it became suspicious to me. It was October of 2016 that I left there, taking off to a CO.AG camp during the anti-pipeline protests with Standing Rock, Lakota. A mix of feeling called to action and having nothing to lose, as I wanted to get out of that house in the worst way. My last night there, I did not give notice that I was leaving. He was drinking and tweaking again, started in on the same conversation, loosely describing murder and sexual violence in the tone of some sort of edgy joke. I told him he would be caught eventually, not even holding back my suspicion anymore. He reiterated that he was the last person police would suspect, and asserted that they wouldn't catch him. He said this in a very serious and concise way, dropping the pretense he had been using before. I left the next morning. This haunted me for months, then a year and a half. I felt as though I hadn't done anything. The guilt was eating away at me. So I called Portland Crime Stoppers and put in an anonymous tip describing what I had described here. When I did, the operator started going back and forth, putting me on hold because the call had piqued the interest of the police sergeant who was assigned to the call center. So they were asking me detailed questions about his vehicle, his house, the methods he described, etc. It seems like they took interest. I gave them as much information as I could remember and left it at that, feeling just a little better that I had at least tried to do something about it. Fast forward to recent times. I told my mother about all of this, and she became interested, asking what house this was, and she ended up pulling it up on G-Maps. She put up the street view, and I noticed that there were a large enclosed trailer in the driveway that wasn't there when I was. I could theorize why it might have been there, but cannot put together a practical reason for it, or why he'd been using it, unless he was moving or using it to haul things to discard. Admittedly, that is pure conjecture, but I couldn't help but wonder. I doubt that I will get closure, or have my suspicions validated, unless he does finally get caught and arrested, and I read about it. I have grown up poor, and been around the low life a lot. I have interacted with many sketchy and unsavory people in my time, but none of them have ever made the impression that Mike made on me. Number 3. I've told this story in other places, on other accounts before, but it bears repeating. One day, when I was an elementary schooler, I was awoken by my mom in a rush. She had overslept, and since she always woke me up in the morning, this meant that I too overslept, and now there was just no way I was going to be ready for school early enough to get on the school bus. School started at 8 a.m., and my bus pickup time was 7 a.m., but it was already 6:40 or something along those lines, and I was still in my pajamas and hadn't even had breakfast yet. So Mom decided that today we would just tell the bus driver to go on ahead and she would take me to school, which would give me plenty of time to get ready. So I'm sitting there at the dining room table eating breakfast, still in my pajamas, and it's now about 6:50. We hear the bus pull up about 10 minutes earlier than usual. My mom peeks her head out of the door into the foggy morning and waves the bus on. She closes the door and comes back inside, but the bus doesn't pull away. There's a knock at the door, and Mom opens it to find a man in a bus driver uniform. He explains that he's a substitute driver because the regular one called in sick. He says he knows he's a few minutes early, since he wanted to get an early start on the route since he didn't know it well. Mom explains to him that she was going to take me to school since we woke up late. He gets visibly upset and says that he can wait a few minutes since he's already running ahead of schedule. My mom insists that, no, I won't be ready to go in a few minutes, and tells him to go on ahead. He seemed angry about this, but turned around and got back in the bus and left. I returned to eating my breakfast, and still don't have my school clothes on at this point, but at 7 a.m. sharp, another bus pulls up to my house. Mom thinks this is weird, and goes outside to talk to them. She comes back inside, looking terrified, but doesn't really say anything about it and tells me to finish getting ready for school. At the time, I didn't know what happened, but Mom would end up telling me a few years later. When she went to this second bus, she found that it was being driven by my regular bus driver, and it was full of all the other kids that are usually on the route. The other bus was empty, by the way. Mom asked the driver about the substitute driver and about him calling in sick.
I never called in sick. There is no substitute driver on my route,
he says. The driver immediately called dispatch in a panic and told my mom to go inside and call the police, which she did without me knowing. There was absolutely no one doing my driver's route that day. Whoever this was most likely a kidnapper who had targeted me. I never heard anything about it again, not even if someone else had ended up being picked up by this mysterious fake bus driver. But chances are, Had I gotten on that bus, I would have never made it to school or back home. And if Mom hadn't overslept on that specific day, I would have been on that bus. Number 4. So this happened about 5 years ago while I was 9 months pregnant. I was Christmas shopping at the mall with my then 7 and 15-year-old daughters one Saturday night in a very safe city with very low crime rate. There was an Applebee's connected to the mall, and we ended our shopping pretty late, and the mall stores were starting to close. So I took my kids to the connected Applebee's for a late dinner. We finish up eating about 10 p.m. and leave out the Applebee's entrance into the practically deserted parking lot with shopping bags in tow. And as we got to the car, I was in the middle of maneuvering the shopping bags on my arms to find my keys when a 50-ish-year-old crusty-looking guy starts walking up from somewhere in the parking lot with shaggy gray hair and a faded flannel shirt and old jeans. I noticed him briskly approaching when he was about 40 feet away, and he said,
"This is a stick-up. Give me all your money."
My blood ran cold, and I stared at him owlishly and shakingly said, "What?" He then said he was just kidding and came up and stood right next to my daughters, who were standing on the other side of the car, waiting for me to unlock the car to let them in. He then starts making small talk with me and my girls. He's asking things like if they were being good girls for Santa, how old they were, if we got all our Christmas shopping done, what kind of things did we get, etc. He didn't seem drunk, high, slow, or mentally challenged at all. He was very coherent and seemed of sound mind. Mind you, I was a heavily pregnant woman, alone with my 2 daughters in a mostly deserted parking lot at 10 o'clock at night, who was being approached by a stranger who came up and stood right next to my kids on the other side of the car, just shooting the breeze, talking to me and my kids with his hands in his pockets and occasionally looking over his shoulder. I didn't want to aggravate him, so I was politely conversing with him and trying to look calm and nonchalant while trying to disguise my frantic hands digging inside my giant purse for my car keys. This exchange went on for a couple minutes while he periodically kept looking over his shoulder. I was silently panicking and trying to politely keep the situation from escalating by calmly and nonchalantly talking to him while also trying in vain to find my damned car keys to get us the hell out of there. They were in there hiding good. I felt that at any moment he was going to pull a knife, gun, or rob me, and my kids were right next to him, away from their mother, on the other side of the car, and I couldn't find my fucking car keys to get my kids into the safety of the car. He kept trying to engage them in conversation, and I could see that my oldest daughter was a little weirded out, and she kept glancing at me to gauge my assessment to the situation. Kids often do that because they tend to not recognize potential danger when they're with their parents, since they see us as their protectors. And being that he was only talking and acting friendly, and I was doing my best to stay calm, they were oblivious to the alarming situation we all were in, and being 9 months pregnant, and that I was no match for this full-grown man, especially if he was hiding a weapon on him. While still desperately digging for my keys, I tried to politely give him hints that the conversation was over by saying things like, "Well, it was nice chatting with you, but I gotta get these kids to bed," and "It was nice meeting you," and telling my girls to say that it was nice meeting him too. My polite attempts to get this guy to leave weren't working because he kept sidestepping my attempts and asking them what their favorite school subjects are and how nice young ladies they were, etc., while I was struggling with the shopping bags and digging in my giant cluttered purse for my car keys. My outgoing 7-year-old was completely oblivious to how not okay this situation was, because he was being friendly and because of the whole "I'm with mommy, so I'm safe" child mentality. So, she started to talk about what she picked out for Daddy for Christmas, and started enthusiastically talking about kid stuff and asking him if he knew what Minecraft was, and keeping this creep from leaving us alone by keeping him engaged in conversation. They didn't realize that I was becoming desperate to get them the hell out of there. Then, I suddenly felt this sinking feeling of dread when I realized that I may have lost my keys in the mall, and that we were stuck outside with this strange man who kept looking over his shoulders and was showing no signs of walking away, and I was thinking that he was waiting for the perfect moment to pounce. All he had to do was grab one of my girls and threaten their life, knowing it would make me do whatever he wanted as long as he wouldn't hurt them. I started to feel my adrenaline start to spike, and my heart and stomach started doing flip-flops, and I felt like at any moment shit was gonna go down, as the gravity of realizing that there was no other people or witnesses around, and that we were totally alone with him, and at that moment the odds were stacked against us, and that he had his chance. Then, all of a sudden, he was all like,
"Okay, it was nice talking with you. See you later,"
and walked off in the same direction as to which he came. It wasn't until then I found my car keys and unlocked the car and told my kids to get in fast, and I got in too and locked the doors and started the car and drove the hell out of there. My 15-year-old lightheartedly and jokingly said, "Okay, that was weird," and laughed. I was overwhelmed with relief, and then I was confused over what just happened. I thought to myself, why the hell would a guy of seemingly sound mind think it's totally acceptable to go out of his way just to approach a woman and her kids in a deserted parking lot late at night just to chit-chat? But being that nothing bad happened, I brushed it off and joked about it too. When we got home, my husband greeted us and asked us how shopping went, and I said it went well, and my 15-year-old told him what happened in the parking lot and how weird it was and was kinda joking about it. I started joking too, saying how I was mentally having a panic attack while trying to look calm, and I started making fun of myself by telling my husband how I was attempting to frantically rummage through my purse to find my car keys. My husband went completely white, and I acknowledged his horrified look of alarm, and I assured him that, albeit creepy, the guy was just talking and eventually left on his own. Now, my father-in-law is a retired sheriff deputy, and my husband went through police academy training after graduating high school. He decided to go to business school instead of becoming a cop, and being that the knowledge he gained from that, plus growing up with a cop for a dad, I found out why my husband looked absolutely horrified when I told him the details. What my husband told me completely rattled me to the bone. My husband told me that he was 100% sure that the reason why that guy was hanging around us and chit-chatting was because he was waiting for me to unlock my car. And the reason why he was standing next to our kids was because once I unlocked the car and the kids started to get inside, he was most likely going to force himself into the car with the kids and hold a knife or gun to them to gain leverage on me to force me to cooperate, knowing that I wouldn't abandon my kids, which would force me to get into the car with them and do whatever he wanted me to do, which most likely would be to drive to a remote location to do God knows what. And being that he wasn't wearing a mask suggests that his intentions were to also leave no witnesses to identify him. I then remembered that he was positioned by the backseat passenger door where my 7-year-old was standing by, waiting to get in. My husband then told me that the most likely reason why the guy ended up leaving was because it took so long for me to find my keys, and the longer it took, the more anxious and spooked it made him. And that whole time, I was desperate to find my car keys, which through some sort of divine intervention stayed hidden in my purse, thus saving us from potentially being abducted. Number 5. Quick backstory. I work at a gas station on a main route. We see a lot of travelers passing through. Only one person works each shift, and it's a 24-hour store. We're short-staffed, so I agreed to an overnight. I'm female, and I work in a state that's always had self-serve gas stations. So this guy comes in. I asked him if he needed any help. He says no. He's getting gas at the pump, but needs to use the bathroom. I go back to work on whatever invoices we got yesterday. The guy uses the bathroom and then goes back outside. About 5 to 7 minutes later, he comes back inside and tells me that he's confused about the pump. He directly says,
"You might have to come outside to help me."
Customers don't often say this. They usually just complain that it's not working, so I'm already feeling weird about this guy. I shake it off because he looks like a nerd and I don't feel afraid of him really. I look at the register to see what error it came up with for his pump, but there's no errors. The register doesn't even say it was in use. Even if someone tries to pay and nothing's wrong with their payment, it will at least say payment/loyalty timed out. But it had no sign of him trying to use it before asking me for help. I ask him if he wants to just pay inside. He agrees to, gets his wallet out of his car, and then pays $10. I give him his receipt and he says,
"Can you help me? I don't understand the machine."
And I say, "We really aren't allowed to leave the store during overnight shifts, as it's just me here and it's not safe to go outside." I don't know why I told him I was alone, but he wasn't seemingly threatening. He proceeds to say,
"Well, I don't understand what it's asking me. I need help. I'm not scary."
I tell him again that I can't go outside because it's a store policy for the overnight shift and say, "It's not that you're scary, I just can't go outside. I would have to tell a little old lady asking for help at this hour the same thing." Which is true. We can't even take out the trash during overnights. He starts to walk away from the register counter now, but then again stops at the door and asks me one last time to come outside and help him. I'm pretty annoyed at this point. I've said no twice now, I'm not going, so stop asking. I finally say in a super annoyed tone, "Okay, all you need to do is 1. Pick up the nozzle, 2. Select the fuel grade, and 3. Put it in your tank and squeeze the handle. I'm not going outside." Then he finally goes back to his car, and the register tells me he had no trouble pumping gas. His plates seem like they're from the state I work in. This kind of thing wouldn't make me suspicious usually, but the fact that he originally opted for me to go outside instead of bringing money inside at 3 o'clock in the morning, mind you, is weird. Along with how he didn't bother to use the pump before he came inside to ask for help, claiming it wasn't working, and him not taking my first no for an answer. Number 6. I was reading a story that reminded me of an event from over 20 years ago. In the second half of 1998, I had taken a job as a security guard at a plant that made locks. Being a kid, I usually worked one of 3 shifts, 4 p.m. to 12 a.m., 7:30 p.m. to 3:30 a.m., or 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. The 7:30 to 3:30 shift was for extra coverage, so there were always 2 of us there from 7:30 to midnight. It was a routine, boring job for the most part. We did our rounds, logged anything out of the ordinary, and watched a tiny monitor displaying the CCTV feed. Things went by in an almost painfully normal manner for 6 months. I worked, saved, bought a car, and planned a move. By late March of 1999, I served my notice and prepared to head cross-country. A new hire was brought in to fill my spot, a soft-spoken man named Calvin. As part of his training, Calvin spent time working at all hours. At night, he was a shadow, working with myself and the other night guard, getting a feel for the plant's nocturnal routines. Most nights, he worked with myself and Amira, a female guard who was around my age. I was 18 at the time. Calvin, who was about a decade older, was quiet and polite, though something seemed to be missing. There's a spark that genuinely nice people seem to have, and he didn't possess it. Whenever he went on rounds with me, he'd ask questions about the job and make small talk. I noticed that he was a little odd, laughing at odd times and changing his tone mid-sentence. At the time, I chalked it up to him being awkward. That wouldn't last. One night, near the end of his first week, he went on rounds with Amira. When they returned to the office, I knew something was wrong. Normally talkative, she would barely say a word. Not sure what had occurred, I waited until Calvin had gone to the restroom to ask. During their trip, everything had been normal until they reached the brass mill, a portion of the plant that shut down at 6 p.m. There were usually no employees there after that time and no lights. They were making their way to a checkpoint on a landing atop a flight of stairs when the mood shifted. She told me that she turned around only to find that he was right on her. Startled, she backed against the grating at the end of the landing, and he leaned in towards her, his face nearly touching hers. He flirted in a low voice, and when she mentioned his wedding band, he said it would be over soon. From then on, I did the rounds, taking Calvin with me each time. The night ended without further incident, and I left a note for our supervisor detailing what had occurred. The next night came and went with no Calvin. I did the rounds while Amira stayed in the locked office. Same thing the night after. Then, on my second to last shift, I come in to find her freaking out. She found out why Calvin hadn't been at work. He had been arrested for murdering his wife. She had been dismembered and burned, parts of her body placed in a pond less than a mile from where we worked. That night and the next, Amira called the jail just to make sure that they were still holding him. Based on the time frame, he had killed his wife months before he started the job. Number 7. Years ago, when I was still a teenager, my friend Justin and I would often go longboarding at night, as my friends and I were quite the night owls. We loved the freedom of almost never seeing another soul on the roads or the paths we frequented. Even when using main roads, it would be very rare to see a car out so late in such a rural area, and you could see and hear them coming from very far away due to their headlights, and the noise of the vehicle disrupting the peaceful silence of the night. We were really into it at the time and would often ride our boards for miles and miles, sometimes not arriving at home until the sun was up. One night in particular, we decided to ride a few miles away from our usual back roads to take one of our favorite hidden routes. It began with a narrow paved path that was the only piece of land separating two sides of a long lake. It would often sink under due to rain, and we wanted to seize the opportunity to use it before it rained and went underwater again. It was roughly 2 miles long and was extremely relaxing to ride through due to the scenery. After making it to the end of the lake, we decided to continue moving and turn into a very close path that leads directly into a densely wooded wilderness preservation. As we came up to the first hill, we looked down at the bottom into the blackness. We both noticed what appeared to be a tiny, moving ball of dim light down there. It moved so strangely, and it was extremely difficult to make out what it was. Rather than shine our flashlight down, we curiously watched it for a few moments, whispering to each other about what it could possibly be. All at once, that small light turned into multiple blinding lights and extremely loud revving sounds, overwhelming our senses that have become accustomed to the dark and silence. Acting purely on fear, we instantly turned around and ran as fast as we could, hearing yelling and revving gaining behind us. By sheer luck, we managed to run off path into a very dark, very overgrown hole in the side of a hill overlooking where we had just come from. We decided to hide in the natural dugout of this hill, hoping the plants and darkness would be enough to protect us from whatever was happening out there. We watched our pursuers right up to where we had originally been standing. There were 4 men, 2 on 4-wheelers and 2 on full-sized motorcycles. They were yelling at each other about something, but we couldn't make out what they were saying due to the distance we had covered. We felt safe enough to whisper very softly to each other and speculated who these people could be. Our first thought was they might be park rangers of some kind, although we had never seen one here in the many times we had been through, and honestly, we doubted that this county had the budget or even the desire to have anyone patrol the deep woods at night. Besides that, these men were on vehicles entirely inappropriate for the paved bike trails, and they were very angry about something. They called out to us for a while, yelling things like,
"We know you're out there.
and
We can see you. Come on out."
we stayed silent and decided to call their bluff instead of running. Eventually, we clearly heard one of the men yell,
"Find them now."
and smash a bottle. That had erased any hope we had that these were just park rangers. We watched them split up, each of them going a different way down the series of paths on their vehicles, including the path we came from. It took us what felt like ages to even move. We were frozen in terror inside that dugout, watching the lights from the vehicles travel through the woods and paths, one of them already coming full circle and passing the point he started from. I thought about calling for help, but I was too afraid to open my phone in fear that even the smallest amount of light would give away our location. After waiting for the lights of the vehicles to reach their farthest distance yet, we finally summoned the nerve to get up and try to run somewhere far enough from these people to safely make a call. We ran as hard and fast as we could through the woods. Since their headlights gave away their location on these paths, we would hide again whenever we felt they were getting too close. Our available hiding spots were getting progressively worse as the woods became less dense, and the fear I felt waiting for one of them to drive past us while basically only being covered in leaves and plants may still be unmatched to this day. Finally, we emerged from the woods onto the intersection of two main roads, far from where we started. We ducked down into the ditch to call for help. When I opened my phone, I noticed I had recent missed calls from one of our other friends, Connor, who we were supposed to meet up with after our longboard excursion. I called him and frantically asked where he was. Luck was with us again. He hadn't given up on our plans despite us ignoring him, and was only a few miles away, already heading in our direction. I gave him the names of the two streets we were near the corner of, and explained that we needed picked up right away. He agreed to speed over to us while Justin and I waited in hiding. Thankfully, Connor arrived before any of those men did. We bolted into the back seats of his car, yelling for him to get out of there, and he took off. Relief doesn't begin to describe what I felt being safely driven home after everything I had just experienced. After explaining everything that happened to Connor, we ended up just moving on with our night and decided not to call the police. We figured they would be gone by the time any officer made it out there, and that we would only be putting ourselves at risk by admitting to breaking the law by taking those paths so late at night. I still have no idea what happened or who those people were. I've been told all kinds of theories from friends and family that have heard this story. Some think we walked right up to a huge drug deal. Justin and I later admitted to each other that when the revving started and we couldn't see, our minds both went straight to chainsaw-wielding horror movie serial killer. So I suppose it could have been much worse. Frustratingly enough, whatever those men thought we saw that made them want to catch us so badly, we never actually saw. We'll never really know, I suppose. Number 8. So, I'm currently a sophomore in college, and the bar scene here is pretty big. Going out for the night to get special deals on alcohol so you can get plastered with your friends is kind of the go-to here. Despite this, I'm not a huge drinker and don't enjoy it a lot because it tastes so bad and hurts my stomach. I do enjoy the company though, and often go just to be out with my friends or meet new people. A lot of times I'm called the dad of the group because I end up taking care of them all the time. That's the prelude to what happened when I decided to go with them one Friday night. So we got all dressed up, pre-gaming a bit at my friend Q's apartment before we Ubered downtown to one of our pretty well-known college bars. After we got in, my friends immediately split off into tiny groups, combing over the club for girls they wanted to try their shot at spending the night with. This is gonna make me sound weird, but one-night stands aren't really my thing, and I don't want to end up cock-blocking my friends, so instead of looking for girls, I usually try someone at the bar and make friends with them. I was chatting with some dude that was wearing a cowboy hat when eventually a girl approached me. She was pretty cute, probably 5'6" with dirty blonde hair and eyes that I think were light brown. But they were so light they almost looked gold, which threw me off a bit. She asked if she could buy me some drinks in exchange for being her friend for the night, and I, of course, accepted, because hey, that's what I came here for anyway, right? Anyways, she kept her word and we started talking to each other, and she introduced herself as Alexia, but to call her Alex. I asked her the basic stuff about if she came with friends, she went to college here, etc., to which all the answers were no. That struck me as pretty odd, as it's honestly pretty unsafe to be in the downtown area alone as a girl at like 1 a.m. in the morning. She said she wanted to hear about me though, and actually seemed pretty excited to listen. It felt like a really nice change of pace because I'm usually the one learning about other people, not the other way around. It also could have been the alcohol starting to take effect, since I'm an actually pretty lightweight guy as I don't binge drink often. The whole time I was talking, she stared into my eyes and had this warm smile that made me feel so acknowledged, if that makes sense. I felt like she was enjoying her time as much as I was, and that just made me even happier because I thought it meant I made a new friend. That was when her demeanor began to change, though. She started to get kind of flirty and eventually asked if I wanted to go home with her. Like I said, I'm not really a one-night stand guy, and I explained that I like to get to know people a little better before sleeping together. I'm pretty sure I saw what I think was anger flash across her face, but it was quickly replaced with another smile, and she suggested going home and watching a movie instead. I agreed and pulled out my phone to begin ordering an Uber, but she basically grabbed my wrist and started guiding me outside. I was confused, trying to ask if she was planning to drive after drinking, but she wouldn't really answer me. We eventually got outside the club, and she pointed to a black Honda Civic parked right at the front of the club. That was when all the warning bells rang like a tornado had passed through them. I was pretty drunk at this point in the night, maybe 6 or 7 drinks deep, but I was still aware enough to see the red flags. She said she had come alone, but the lane the car was parked in was only for pickups, and I never saw her order an Uber. Somebody would have had to be driving the car. This was enough to make me uncomfortable, and I asked again if she was planning to drive the car. She said yes as she continued walking me closer to it. I knew that was a bald-faced lie. And as we got closer, my heart sank as I noticed the outline of 3 other men in the car. At that point, my adrenaline kicked in, and I yanked my hand away from her and said there's no way in hell I'm getting in that car with her. She tried begging me one more time, saying she really wanted to have sex and would let me do whatever I wanted, but I already had turned around to walk back to the club. She started cussing me out, practically screaming at the top of her lungs as I walked back up to the bouncers to go in. I texted my friends what happened, and we all met back up and went home. It was obvious she was going to college bars trying to get guys drunk before offering to sleep with them, so she could get them in that car with 3 other men to rob them or do God knows what else. I called my city's anonymous tip line and left a detailed description of the girl, car, and place where it happened. That night was a real wake-up call for me, and I'm so thankful that despite being drunk that night, I was able to piece together what was happening before it was too late. Please remember to always be safe when going out with friends, especially when it's late at night or if alcohol is involved. Number 9. This is an experience I had about 6 years ago, when I was living with my boyfriend at the time in a very small backwoods town in West Virginia. It was 23 miles from the interstate to my house, and there was only one house close enough to be seen from our house. The majority of traffic through our road was actually trucks carrying fracking wastewater, and it was extremely rare to see people out walking around in this area. I had never seen it before, so it was a peaceful place, but it could be pretty creepy all on its own. We lived in a single-wide trailer next to my boyfriend's boss, his wife, and 3 kids. We were pretty close with them, and they were actually the reason we moved out to the area. We had spent a substantial amount of time out there before we moved out, and had never really had any unsettling experiences. However, it did not take long for that to change. We moved into our house as soon as the previous tenants moved out. My boyfriend's boss said that they were into partying. They constantly had people over, etc. We had been living in a total shithole of a studio apartment, so we were really eager to start our new lives in a legitimate house. The first night we stayed there, I could have sworn I heard someone rummaging around in our back porch. There were a few things still out there from the previous tenants, but I wrote it off as my mind playing tricks on me in this remote new location. However, strange noises continued to occur almost every single night. Rustling behind the house, thumps and thuds on the front porch, mostly things that could definitely be animals and not people. My boyfriend never seemed to hear them or just chose to actively ignore them, and he reaffirmed my original conclusion that it was all in my head. About a month after we moved in, I woke up to the sound of frantic pounding on my back door. The back door was just outside the door to our bedroom, so it was pretty loud. I laid there, half convinced I was dreaming, for at least a full minute while the pounding continued. At this point, I realized I am completely awake. What the actual fuck is going on? I shook my boyfriend, but he was an extremely deep sleeper, so he kinda just made some noises and rolled over. I tried to tell him there's someone on our back porch, but it was like he couldn't even hear it. This continued for probably about 5 more minutes before it quit abruptly. I was mortified at this point, physically shaking, and I had been too scared to get up and go look myself. After about 10 minutes, I was convinced that whoever/whatever was out there must be gone, hopefully. So I got up to look out the back window. Nothing. Front window, nothing. No sign that anyone had been there. I was wide awake and figured I would be up for the rest of the night. But being so far from everything with no internet, cable, or phone service, I got bored quickly and climbed back into bed and eventually drifted off. I told my boyfriend about it in the morning, and he agreed that it was pretty creepy and that we should maybe get a camera or something in case it ever happens again. We both went about our days and went over to the neighbor's house to visit with the kids and have dinner. Before I even mentioned it to her, the wife of the family started telling me that her daughter had made her so mad the night before by suddenly remembering at midnight that she had a project due for school the next day that she had not started on, nor did she have the materials for. Fuming, she got herself dressed again and went to head out to Walmart to get some supplies to bail her daughter out of failing this project. As she started to get into her car, she saw someone walking along the road out past her house. As she was already pissed off and generally has no filter anyway, she hollered out, "Can I help you with something?" And when he turned around to look at her, she said her heart sunk. She said that he may have been some kind of tweaker or strung out on drugs or something along those lines. But his face was pale and his eyes were sunken in, and his appearance was disheveled and generally alarming. He looked back at her for a moment, then turned around and continued walking without a word. She got into her car to head out to Walmart, thinking she'd pass him and get a better look at him on the way. As she rounded the bend just past our houses, she realized that he was gone. There is literally nothing between our houses and the next houses except woods for at least a mile, meaning he almost certainly disappeared into the woods. While we never saw him again or had any further disturbances, for the rest of our residency there, I could not shake the feeling that he must be watching us. I can still hear the pounding, like it was yesterday. Was this guy living in the woods? Was he looking for someone who used to live there that he did drugs with? Did he need any help? We will never know. He certainly gave me the longest lingering feeling of unease in history. Number 10. This experience happened to me when I was 14 years old. I hadn't spoken to anyone about the event since it happened, not even my significant other. I'm 20 years old now, about to double major with my first 2 degrees in psychology and anthropology. Recently, for reasons unknown to me, the memories of this strange happening have resurfaced and are continuing to plague my waking thoughts, as well as my unconscious and subconscious. As we are taught in psychology, talking about the situation could help with repressed trauma, so here it goes. I live in the high desert mountains of Southern California, situated just below the Sierra Nevadas about 30 minutes west of Mojave. My town is no booming metropolis. At this time, our largest market was a Kmart, one of the last still in business, I might add, and we only had 4 stoplights in town. This takes place in a subsection of the town, about 13 miles from the shops, banks, and restaurants, in a small community largely inhabited by retirees. It's smack dab in the middle of summer, and the temperatures were well in the high 90s to low hundreds. My nightly routine would consist of walking my Australian Shepherd. However, I would wait until it was almost dark to avoid the heat. I grabbed my phone, a small pocket knife, some headphones, my pup, and set out for my nightly walk. My community is also home to a significant amount of equestrian riders, as well as cattle ranchers. The trails I walked were designated horse riding trails set between pastures. That night, I had decided to take the horse trail that stretches for approximately 2 miles between back-to-back paddocks. It's basically a long, narrow trail that's between very large backyards. My ending destination was the Equestrian Center, a communal equestrian park where all types of horse riders could enjoy various activities on their horses. Making my way through the sandy terrain of the trail, it was nearly dark now. The sky was becoming a deeper shade of blue every time I looked up, and my dog was becoming harder to see. I estimated my arrival at the Equestrian Center to be about 15 minutes from my current position, so I sent a text to my mother. "I'll be at the Equestrian Center in about 15 minutes. Could you meet me there? I'm too tired to walk back." My mother had replied, "Sure, I'll leave in 10 minutes. Now, at this point, I was just outside the east entrance of the Equestrian Center, where the Enchanted Forest Trail connects to the straight trail I was on, sort of like a 3-way intersection. You can either go left into the Enchanted Forest Trail or go straight into the Equestrian Center. Before I reached the intersection of the trails, I noticed a shift in my dog's behavior as she becomes anxious and seemingly worried. She had her eyes fixated to the forest and stopped dead in her tracks. I played it off as another animal within the forest, like a bobcat or boar, as they weren't uncommon in my area. I gave her a slight tug on her collar, although she was still incessantly focused on the forest. With a little more convincing, I was able to get her moving forward, pushing on towards the Equestrian Center, where my mother would be waiting for us. Now, it was nearly pitch black with only the moon guiding me with its low light. There was just the slightest of visibility, forcing me to turn on my cell phone's dim flashlight. Entering the Equestrian Center now, I noticed something that startled me immensely. A very tall person, a man, about 10 to 15 feet into the Enchanted Forest Trail, with his back towards me standing completely still. His head facing the sky and his hands open, palms pointing in front of him while his arms are at his side. He was tall, approximately 6 feet, slim build, short dark hair, was wearing what looked like to be light blue scrubs, or at least a very thin blue napkin-like material, and was barefoot. What startled me the most was his demeanor and what he was doing. His stance was enough to scare anyone in that setting, but as I approached him slowly, it appeared to me he was shaking, vibrating, or slightly convulsing, but doing so while standing up. It didn't seem like he had any control over it, although he remained his balance perfectly. Scared and not entirely sure what to do, I asked him, "Hello, excuse me?" I paused momentarily and raised my voice slightly with the next question. "Is everything all right?" When I said that, he stopped shaking altogether, but still doesn't turn around or move another muscle. He just remains that same creepy position and doesn't even move. For a brief moment, I thought I might have been imagining this. I glanced down at my dog, and she was also concerned with the state and condition of this man and began growling quietly. To then I knew it wasn't all in my head. When I looked back up, he had moved closer to me, about 7 feet, now almost on my trail path. I had only looked at my dog for a split second, and he did it without making a sound. He still wasn't facing me either, and his hands were still open and still facing the sky. I wasn't about to wait to see what this guy was doing or what his intentions were, so I slowly eased my way past him towards the equestrian center as quietly as I could before I felt that I was at a safe enough distance to start sprinting as fast as I could away from this guy. When I reached the first arena of the equestrian center, I looked back into the direction of Forrest completely out of breath, and there he was. The fucker was standing on the edge of trail outside the forest, standing there, facing me. I was too far away to see his face, and frankly, I didn't want to. I couldn't make out features. All I could see was a silhouette illuminated by the moonlight peeking through the forest trail. I continued to run, with no intention of stopping until I found someone. I had never been so happy to see my nagging neighbor Penny and her moody mare Jolene riding in the Milano area. She had noticed my distress, but due to her already harsh opinions of me, I had told her I had been on an endurance run and was just very out of breath and tired. I wanted to avoid any small-town gossip as much as I could. My mother arrived with impeccable timing. During the ride home, I broke down into a state of paranoia, distress, and panic at what I had just witnessed. My mother didn't know exactly what to make of it, so she recommended I file a police report with the local PD. About an hour after getting home, an officer shows up to take my statement. Following up the next day, the same officer claims to have went and checked out the area, but didn't find anyone or anything out of the blue apart from partials or bare footprints. But there's nothing that incriminates it suspicious about someone going for a walk without shoes. He played it off as a joke and accused me of being under the influence, but I can assure you, I was completely sober. Nothing ever came out of this. I attended weekly therapy sessions for almost 2 years following this event, and never went on walks by myself ever again. I had night terrors about this man and still do. I still don't know what to make of it. I don't know if I ever will.